Researchers attack AMD's Infinity Fabric to bypass hardware security protections with Fabricked flaw. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. It's called Fabricked, and it lets malicious code bypass every protection AMD built into their processors over the last decade. Here's what makes this different from every other chip vulnerability you've heard about. Infinity Fabric is not a software layer. It's not a firmware update you can patch in a few weeks. It's the physical interconnect that glues every core, every cache, every memory controller together inside modern AMD processors. It's the nervous system of the chip. And researchers just prove they can hijack it. The attack works like this. Malicious code running on one core can exploit how Infinity Fabric handles memory transactions between cores. The researchers call it a side-channel attack. They're not crashing the system or triggering an alert. They're quietly eavesdropping on data that's supposed to be isolated. They can see what other cores are doing. They can steal encryption keys. They can exfiltrate sensitive data without leaving a trace the operating system would catch. Why does this matter right now? AMD Ryzen and EPYC processors power millions of machines, from gaming PCs to data centers running cloud infrastructure. If you're hosting applications on AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, there's a good chance your workload runs on AMD EPYC hardware. This vulnerability exists in all of them. But here's the part that keeps security researchers awake. This is not a buffer overflow or a software flaw that patches in 48 hours. This is a hardware design issue. The Infinity Fabric itself, the way it moves data between cores, has a fundamental weakness. AMD can't patch their way out of this. They can't release a BIOS update and fix it. The only real mitigation is a microcode update that disables certain performance features, or a complete redesign of how Infinity Fabric handles memory isolation in future generations. That means every AMD processor sold in the last 5 years, billions of dollars of hardware already deployed, is vulnerable. Gaming rigs. Workstations. Enterprise servers. All of them. Now, here's what AMD will probably do. They'll release a microcode patch that adds mitigation, probably something that introduces latency penalties or reduces the attack surface. It won't be perfect. Performance will take a hit. System administrators will face a choice: apply the patch and accept 5 to 15% performance degradation, or stay vulnerable. For data centers, this creates real pressure. If your competitors patch and you don't, you're running unmitigated hardware flaws. If you do patch, your per-core performance drops, and your infrastructure costs go up because you need more hardware to deliver the same throughput. Here's the contrarian angle nobody's talking about yet. This vulnerability actually validates Intel's security architecture in certain domains. Intel's core isolation mechanisms are different from AMD's. Intel's approach requires different attack vectors. This doesn't mean Intel is immune, they have their own vulnerabilities, but it means the market is about to remember that security design choices matter. And vendors who cut corners get exposed, hard. For investors, watch AMD's stock reaction. For enterprise buyers, start asking your cloud providers what mitigation they're deploying and what the performance impact will be. For security researchers, this opens a whole new attack surface to explore. For chip designers at every company, AMD, Intel, ARM, anyone building processors, this is a design lesson. Infinity Fabric's weakness is that it optimizes for speed without enough isolation. That's a trade-off that just became expensive. The real story is this: hardware vulnerabilities are harder to fix than software ones, and they scale across billions of deployed devices. Fabricked proves that. Even the most critical infrastructure components can have blind spots. And once they're public forever. This matters because it shifts how companies will approach processor procurement for the next 18 months. It changes the risk calculus for data center workloads that handle sensitive data. And it reminds us that security is not an afterthought, it's a design constraint that affects every architectural choice. Watch for AMD's official statement in the next 48 hours. Watch for performance benchmarks comparing patched versus unpatched systems. And watch for this to become a conversation at every enterprise security meeting for the next quarter. This vulnerability is not going away, and neither is the pressure on AMD to respond. Subscribe for daily intelligence on how security breaches reshape tech markets and infrastructure decisions. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.